Shiny armor, grandiose speeches, and perfect abs are just a pretty wrapper. The real story of King Leonidas doesn't smell like glory. It smells like rancid oil, sour wine, and caked blood. You think you know the hero who saved Greece? But are you ready to learn the truth about a man who was not just a warrior, but the result of a monstrous selective breeding experiment where children were culled like livestock? In this video, we will descend into the hell of Spartan upbringing, where 7-year-old boys were turned into bio-robots void of pity. You will learn about the humiliations and the night hunts on living people that the future king had to endure just to earn the right to exist. We will uncover the dirty political intrigues behind his ascent to the throne, why he, merely the third-string spare heir, got the crown, and why he had to marry his own niece to secure power. Why were the legendary 300 Spartans not just the best warriors, but especially selected suicide club, each of whom had a son growing up at home? How did Leonidas manage to trick his own priests and bureaucrats to lead men to the slaughter during a sacred holiday? And what gruesome act did Xerxes commit over the fallen hero's body? An act that many textbooks shamefully omit. Watch until the end, because the finale of this story isn't just death in a canyon. It is a chilling chronicle of how one man, stripped of a childhood and the right to fear, turned his own death into the most expensive show in ancient history. The truth about Thermopylae is far more terrifying and cynical than any myth. Forget the shine of gold armor from Hollywood blockbusters. Wipe from your memory the grandiose speeches delivered under rolling thunder with a perfectly groomed beard. The real history smells different. It smells of the rancid olive oil rubbed onto skin before a fight, of sour black wine, and of copper dust that settles in the lungs and turns breathing into a wheeze. We are used to seeing Leonidas as an icon, a symbol of sacrifice, a marble statue come to life to save freedom. But let's be honest, you wouldn't want to meet this man in a dark alley. You wouldn't want him as a neighbor. And you certainly wouldn't wish such a fate on your child. Leonidas wasn't a hero in the sense we use the word today. He was a project, the result of a monstrous eugenics experiment that spanned centuries. Sparta was not a state. It was a military order disguised as a city, where architecture was absent as a class because the muscles of its citizens were considered the best walls. And Leonidas became the pinnacle of this engineering, the perfect instrument forged with a single goal: to kill effectively, massively, and without hesitation. Imagine the Eurotas Valley in the year 540 BC. The heat here is so intense, it feels like the air itself is melting. In the shadow of the Taygetus mountain range lies a settlement, looking more like a cluster of 5 villages than the capital of the Peloponnesian hegemon. No colonnades, no theaters, only barracks, parade grounds, and temples where they pray to the gods of war. It was here that the first cry of the infant, destined to become a nightmare for the Persian Empire, rang out. But at that moment, no one saw a king in him. Fate played a cruel joke on Leonidas, one that ultimately saved Greece. He wasn't supposed to rule. His father, King Anaxandridas II, had a complicated, almost anecdotal situation with his wives, worthy of its own soap opera. The first wife didn't give birth for a long time, and the ephors, those grey cardinals of Spartan politics, forced the king to take a second one. The second wife gave birth to Cleomenes, an heir with clear signs of mental instability. And then, as if mocking logic, the first wife suddenly began birthing sons one after another. First Dorius, then Leonidas. Leonidas was the third. A backup for the backup. A useless extra mouth in the royal family. And this is the most important fact in his biography. If he had been born first, his life would have been as soft as possible in Sparta. Heirs to the throne were the only people in all of Lacedaemon exempt from the mandatory education system. They were protected. They weren't whipped to strengthen their spirit, They didn't have to steal food to survive. But Leonidas was just a prince, a younger son. That meant no privileges applied to him. The law of Lycurgus was as ruthless to him as it was to the son of a potter or a blacksmith. Spartan eugenics knew no pity. Think about this process. It wasn't just selection. It was industrial quality control. As soon as the umbilical cord was cut, Leonidas's fate was decided not by his father, but by the council of elders of his tribe. They examined the infant, not with affection, but with the cold calculation of a butcher selecting the best cut at the market. Are the bones strong? Is the chest broad enough? Are there defects? If the commission had found a flaw, the future hero of Thermopylae would have simply been thrown into the Apothete Gorge or left to die of hunger on the slopes of Taygetus. Weakness in Sparta was considered a contagious disease, and there was only one cure for it: death. But Leonidas passed this first test. He was deemed fit material. Exactly that. Not a child, but material. A blank for a future hoplite. The first 7 years of his life passed in the relative comfort of his mother's house. But even this comfort was soaked in the ideology of war. Wet nurses in Sparta were famous throughout Greece. They didn't swaddle babies, giving freedom to their limbs, and taught them not to fear darkness or solitude. If a child cried, he wasn't comforted. He was taught that tears were a waste of the body's water. You look at the history of Thermopylae and see the feat of the 300. But ask yourself an uncomfortable question. Who do you have to become to stand under a rain of arrows and laugh? A normal person runs from death. The instinct of self-preservation is the strongest driver of our psyche. To break it, you need something more than just training. You need to completely reformat the personality. Erase the I and replace it with we. Turn a human into a function. Leonidas was the only king in Spartan history to undergo the full cycle of the Agoge. 13 years of hell, humiliation, hunger, and pain. This is exactly what made him a monster in the eyes of his enemies and a god in the eyes of his men. When he leads his warriors into the fiery gates, they won't follow a title. They will follow one of their own. Someone who slept on a bed of stinging nettles just like them, who gnawed on raw meat just like them, and who knew the taste of his own blood on split lips. We are used to romanticizing Spartans. Oh, those noble warriors in red cloaks. But the truth is that Sparta built its greatness on the bones of both slaves and its own citizens. Freedom for them meant absolute dominance. For little Leonidas, childhood ended exactly at 7 years old. No farewell parties, no mother's tears on the doorstep. Spartan women were forbidden from showing public grief. His father, the king, simply nodded when the overseers came for the boy. The door closed. The warm world of women and children's games vanished forever. Ahead awaited cold barracks, where the only way to keep warm was to press against a comrade's body. Ahead was a world where pity was considered treason, and cruelty a virtue. The boy named Leonidas died the day he stepped over the threshold of the barracks. The creation of the perfect killing tool began. The engineers of human souls picked up their instruments. And so you stand before a choice, staring into the abyss of centuries. Who is before us? A victim of a tyrannical system, stripped of the right to love and compassion? Or a Superman who voluntarily accepted his fate? Don't rush to answer. To understand Leonidas, we have to descend with him into the very heat of it. We have to go through the years when every day could have been the last. In Sparta, they didn't say good morning. They checked if you were even awake. The Agoge system didn't just teach fighting. It taught survival in conditions where the whole world wants to destroy you. And the little prince, the third son, forgotten by history for the time being, took his first step into this meat grinder. He didn't know yet that every humiliation, every strike of the stick, every stolen piece of cheese was a brick in the foundation of a monument that would stand for millennia. The world was preparing for war. In the east, a Persian storm was gathering strength. Meanwhile, in the dusty palestras of Lacedaemon, a 7-year-old boy was learning to stand still when a gadfly bit his skin, not to blink when sand flew into his eyes, and to remain silent. Especially to remain silent. Because words were cheap, and in Sparta, only steel and blood had value. Welcome to the hell they called home. The forging process had begun. Welcome to the incubator, where they removed the soul from humans to replace it with a manual. 13 years. Think about that number. 13 years of continuous, methodical grinding down of the personality. The Agoge wasn't a school in our understanding. There were no desks, no vacations, and no kind teachers giving grades for diligence. It was a maximum security correctional camp where you landed at 7 years old without the right to parole. And Prince Leonidas, son of Anaxandridas, walked through those gates on equal terms. No soft pillows, no servants. Only hard ground, cold, and a pack of wolf cubs just like him, ready to tear out a throat for an extra piece of bread. The first thing taken from them was comfort. Shoes were forbidden. Winter and summer, over scorching stones or frost, future hoplites walked barefoot. This wasn't the whim of sadistic overseers, it was pure physics. The foot had to turn into a sole insensitive to pain, capable of keeping traction on any surface. Because in a phalanx, when you are pushed from behind and pressed from the front, slipping means dying. Clothing? One himation, a rough wool cloak, for the whole year. It didn't warm, it merely covered nakedness. The skin toughened, weathered, turning into natural armor. Spartans didn't need jackets, they grew their own armor. They slept on bedding they had to make themselves. And here began the first lesson. He who knows how to work with his hands survives. The boys went to the banks of the Eurotas to break stiff reeds with their bare hands, without knives. Try breaking a reed stalk with your palms. You'll slice your fingers to the bone. But the blood didn't concern anyone. It was believed that pain in the hands distracted from the cold in the back. The old men said that in winter, you could mix prickly thistle into this reed. It pricks, preventing deep sleep, but creates a sensation of warmth through skin irritation. Monstrous logic? No, Spartan efficiency. But the main teacher in the Agoge was hunger. Exactly that, with a capital letter. They were given just enough food so the child wouldn't die of exhaustion, but never enough to be full. The stomach had to be empty, and the eyes hungry. Why starve the nation's elite? The answer is cynical and brilliant. A well-fed man is lazy. A hungry man is inventive. The system specifically pushed children into crime. Want to eat? Steal. Sneak into the pantry, climb into a neighbor's garden, swipe a piece of meat from the sacrificial table. Theft in Sparta was not a vice, but a mandatory discipline. But with one nuance. Getting caught was forbidden. If a boy was caught red-handed, he was beaten. Not for stealing. He was beaten for being clumsy, for allowing himself to be discovered. Leonidas, the future king, stole cheese and hid in the shadows just the same, clutching the loot in his hand while his heart pounded like a running hare's. This taught stealth, night orientation, and cunning. A Spartan shouldn't just be strong. He must be dangerous, like a snake in tall grass. The apotheosis of this upbringing was the rituals at the altar of Artemis Orthia. Imagine the sun-drenched courtyard of the temple. Pieces of cheese lie on the altar. The task is simple. Grab them and run away. But the path to the altar is blocked by older youths with whips. And they don't whip playfully. They whip to maim. The air fills with the whistle of leather and dull thuds. But the most terrifying thing in this scene is the silence. Screaming is forbidden. Crying is forbidden. If you make a sound, you disgrace not yourself, but your entire lineage. Historians write that sometimes children died right there at the altar under the lashes, never letting out a sound. And Leonidas saw this. He saw his friends' backs turn into bloody pulp and learned the king's most important skill, watching the suffering of his people with icy calm. There was no sadism for sadism's sake in this ritual. It was an inoculation against the fear of pain. When you've gone through the meat grinder of Orthia, the sight of Persian arrows or the shine of enemy swords no longer causes panic. You know your pain threshold. You know the body can endure much more than the mind thinks. But physical pain is only half of it. The darkest stain on Spartan education is the Crypteia, a secret war the state waged against its own slaves. When youths reached a certain age and showed promise, they were sent into the field. They were given nothing but a short Xiphos sword. By day, they had to hide in the forests, sleep on the ground, be invisible. And at night, they went out on the hunt. Their game was the helots, those rightsless farmers whose labor sustained Sparta. The task was simple and gruesome. Find the strongest, sturdiest helot, the one who could potentially lead an uprising, and eliminate him. Quietly, quickly, without witnesses. This wasn't war, it was reverse selection. Exterminating the best among the slaves so the herd remained submissive. Leonidas, like all the best graduates of the Agoge, passed through this blood. Imagine a teenager sneaking up in the dark on a grown man. One strike, a wheeze, and dissolving into the night. You might ask, how does this relate to honor? Spartan ethics didn't operate with concepts of honor in our chivalrous understanding. For them, only efficiency existed. A helot is an enemy. An enemy must be suppressed. Period. Murder in the Crypteia removed the psychological barrier. Killing a human for the first time is a shock. Killing the 10th is work. Sparta obtained warriors who had pity surgically amputated. They didn't see a father, son, or husband in an opponent. They saw a target, a mark, biomass that needed to be pierced with a spear. This formed what would later be called hive mind. In the Agoge, any manifestation of individuality was methodically etched out. I is a dangerous pronoun. There is only we. You are not Leonidas, you are part of the second rank. Your shield covers not you, but the man on the left. If you flinch, your neighbor dies. If your neighbor flinches, you die. This mutual responsibility created a bond stronger than blood ties. They ate from the same cauldron, that black broth, a stew of pork, blood, vinegar, and salt. Guests from other Greek policies, tasting this dish, joked, "Now I understand why Spartans go to death so easily. Better to die than eat this every day." But this food provided energy and didn't pamper the taste buds. A Spartan must be an ascetic. He must be able to sleep on stones and eat what turns an Athenian's stomach. By age 20, when the training course ended, standing before us was no longer a human. It was a bio-robot, a perfectly tuned mechanism. He could march for 24 hours without water. He could endure pain that would make others lose consciousness. He knew how to kill in a dozen different ways, and did it with the efficiency of a slaughterhouse butcher. But most importantly, he knew how to obey. Absolutely, blindly, instantly. Leonidas survived. He didn't break in the reeds of the Eurotas, didn't scream under the whips of Artemis, and didn't flinch in the night raids of the Crypteia. The system designed to break the weak made him steel. He learned the main art that would save him in the future, not on the battlefield, but in the snake pit of the royal palace. He learned to wear a mask of total indifference, a mask of a stone idol, behind which neither fear nor doubt nor ambition could be read. And this mask came in handy very soon, when he returned from the barracks to the world of high politics, where strikes were delivered not with fists, but with whispers and poison. It would seem that after 13 years in the hell of the Agoge, where every day was a fight for survival, returning to the royal palace should have been a vacation. But that's an illusion. If the barracks were a meat grinder for the body, the court of the Agiad dynasty proved to be a press for the psyche. Here they didn't beat with whips. Here they killed with ambitions, intrigues, and madness. Leonidas stepped out of one cage with predators only to land in another, where the beasts wore crowns and smiled before tearing out a throat. Power in Sparta wasn't a privilege, it was a curse multiplied by paranoia. Officially, the state had two kings, two dynasties, the Agiads and the Eurypontids. This system was created specifically so rulers would hate each other, watch each other, and be unable to usurp absolute power. But at the end of the 6th century BC, the balance collapsed. Sparta was ruled by Leonidas's half-brother, Cleomenes I, and the word ruled doesn't quite fit here. He terrorized it. Cleomenes was a figure of titanic scale and equal madness. It was he who turned Sparta's foreign policy into a series of bloody adventures. He burned sacred groves with people inside, bribed oracles in Delphi, and overthrew tyrants in Athens. But the most terrifying things happened behind closed doors. Cleomenes became addicted to the Scythian way of drinking wine, undiluted. For a Greek, this wasn't just drunkenness, it was barbarism, the voluntary destruction of the mind. Leonidas lived in the shadow of this volcano. Imagine his position. He is the third son. Between him and the throne stood two men, the mad Cleomenes and the proud Dorius. Dorius, Leonidas's full brother, was the golden boy, handsome, strong, confident the crown would be his. When the Council of Elders gave power to Cleomenes, Dorius made a fatal mistake. He let resentment overpower reason. "If I can't be king here, I'll be king somewhere else," he decided, and left to colonize Africa and Sicily. This pride cost him his head. He died in foreign lands, senselessly and ingloriously. Leonidas learned this lesson. He understood what his brother didn't. Patience is also a weapon. While Dorius sought glory across the sea, and Cleomenes drowned his reason in wine, Leonidas became invisible. He was the perfect Spartan, silent, obedient, unnoticeable. He didn't claim power, didn't argue in councils, didn't gather supporters around him. He simply waited. It was the strategy of a predator, capable of lying motionless in the grass for hours, waiting for the prey to make a mistake. The atmosphere at court resembled a thriller. Cleomenes was going mad more and more obviously. He started seeing enemies in the shadows. He beat ephors with his staff. Whispers in the corners became louder than screams. And in the center of this chaos, Leonidas made his main political move. He got married. But not for love. In the world of high politics, feelings are an unaffordable luxury. He took Gorgo as his wife, Cleomenes' only daughter, his own niece. For a modern person, this sounds wild, but for Sparta, it was a grand master move. By marrying the king's daughter, Leonidas closed the circle of succession on himself. He became not just the king's brother, but also his son-in-law and the guardian of his grandchildren. He tied himself to power with unbreakable bonds while taking not a single step against the current ruler. Gorgo, by the way, was a match for her husband. She is credited with the phrase, "Only Spartan women give birth to real men." She was smart, cynical, and understood the rules of the game no worse than Leonidas. They became the perfect power tandem. The climax came suddenly and bloodily. Cleomenes' madness reached its peak. He was declared insane and locked in stocks under supervision. But even in chains, he remained dangerous. Herodotus describes his death as a scene from a horror movie. Cleomenes begged a guard for a knife and began methodically slicing himself into pieces, starting from the shins and moving up to the stomach until he died. Suicide? Or did someone place the knife in the madman's hand to save the state from disgrace? We will never know, but the fact remains: the throne was vacant. Leonidas was already over 40, by ancient standards, deep maturity, almost old age. He wasn't a young revolutionary eager to overturn the world. A veteran ascended the throne, a man with a heavy gaze who had passed the Agoge, survived his brother's paranoia and another's death. He received power not because he wanted it, but because he survived. He was the last one left standing in this deadly game of musical chairs. And so, he is king. The year 540 was replaced by new dates. The century was rolling toward its bloody zenith. Leonidas received governance of a state that looked like a monolith from the outside, but was torn apart by contradictions on the inside. Helots in Messenia were sharpening knives, preparing for rebellion. Allies in the Peloponnesian League grumbled about Sparta's hegemony. The aristocracy was bogged down in corruption. But Leonidas was ready. Years of silence taught him to hear what wasn't said. Years in the shadows taught him to value the light. He didn't become a reformer. He became a guardian. A tough, conservative pragmatist who understood any changes are akin to death. Sparta needed to be frozen, preserved in its military perfection. Any crack in discipline, and everything collapses. He ruled for 10 years. 10 years of relative quiet. It seemed the gods finally gave Lacedaemon a respite. Leonidas drilled the phalanx, offered sacrifices, sat in the Gerousia. It was the calm before the storm, so dense and thick you could cut it with a knife. No one in Sparta knew yet that far away in the east, in the golden palaces of Susa and Persepolis, a decision had already been made that would cross out all these petty Greek intrigues. While Leonidas strengthened his power, on the other side of the world, the young king of kings, Xerxes, was trying on his father Darius's crown. The enormous machine of the Persian Empire began to move. The wheels of thousands of wagons creaked, horses neighed, and heralds in hundreds of languages announced the gathering. History was preparing an exam for Leonidas that he had been walking toward his whole life. Sparta's internal demons were defeated or cornered. The time had come to meet the external demon. And this demon was already knocking at the gates of Europe, demanding the simplest and most humiliating thing: earth and water. The embassy of death was already on its way. While Leonidas strengthened his power in the silence of the Eurotas, the world outside Greece was changing with frightening speed. If Sparta was a hammer, the Persian Empire was an anvil the size of a continent. By the year 481 BC, Xerxes I, king of kings, completed preparations for what was to be the final period in the history of free Hellas. This wasn't just an invasion. It was the displacement of an entire civilization. Imagine power that knows no borders. Xerxes didn't consider himself just a ruler. In his understanding, He was the earthly embodiment of truth, a bridge between Ahura Mazda and humans. His court in Susa drowned in such luxury that to a Spartan, it would seem like a nauseating disease. Tons of gold, purple fabrics, the smell of incense that makes the head spin, and thousands of servants falling prostrate at a single movement of the royal finger. For Xerxes, Greeks were not rivals, but an annoying mistake on the map. Dirty barbarians who simply hadn't yet realized their happiness, to become slaves of the best empire in history. The contrast between these two worlds was absolute. On one side, Persian globalization, offering order, roads, trade, and satiety in exchange for submission. On the other, the Spartan cult of death, offering only sweat, blood, and the right to die standing. These two systems could not coexist on one planet. One of them had to disappear. And Xerxes, being a rational empire manager, decided to start with diplomacy. Why waste arrows if you can buy submission with fear? Ambassadors were sent to the cities of Greece. Their demands were deceptively simple: earth and water. In the diplomatic language of that time, this meant unconditional surrender. You give us your land, territory, and water, resources of life, and we graciously allow you to live under our heel. Most Greek policies, seeing the might of the East, faltered. Thessaly, Thebes, Argos, they bowed their heads, choosing the life of a slave over the death of a hero. Petty princes rushed to assure the ambassadors of their loyalty, hoping to keep their tiny thrones. But when the Persian delegation arrived in Lacedaemon, it was as if they had landed on another planet. They were met not by palaces with fountains, but by dusty streets resembling a military camp. They were met by people who wore no jewelry and looked at Persian gold as useless trash that gets in the way of battle. Can you imagine the culture shock? Dressed-up nobles in silks and perfumes standing before the Gerousia, a council of old men in rough cloaks whose faces looked like old oak bark. The scene that followed became a legend, but let's strip it of Hollywood gloss. In the movie, Leonidas shouts, "This is Sparta!" and kicks the ambassador in the chest in a fit of rage. The reality was much more terrifying and cold. Killing an ambassador is not just a crime. In the ancient world, the person of an ambassador was inviolable. It was protected by religious law, by Zeus himself. Killing an ambassador meant bringing the curse of the gods upon the city. No one did that. Even the wildest barbarians honored the laws of hospitality. Leonidas knew this. His action wasn't an emotional breakdown. It was a cold, calculated political operation. When the ambassadors demanded earth and water, the king realized negotiations are impossible. Any compromise would split the Greek resistance. A step had to be taken, after which there would be no return. Bridges had to be burned, and so brightly that the flames would be seen even in Athens. "You want earth and water?" Leonidas asked, and there was no shouting in his voice, only a dry statement of fact. "Take them yourself. There's plenty down there." Spartans didn't throw the ambassadors off a high cliff. They threw them into a well. It was an act of extreme cynicism. You asked for water? Here it is. You asked for earth? It's at the bottom. This wasn't an execution. It was disposal. Calmly, without unnecessary words, the guards pushed the diplomats, screaming in terror and indignation, to the edge of the dark hole in the ground. A splash. A dull thud. And silence. At that moment, Leonidas signed a death warrant for himself and his men. But that was exactly what he was after. By killing the ambassadors, he made war inevitable. He deprived Sparta of the opportunity to change its mind. Now they had no choice, either victory or total annihilation. because Xerxes would never forgive such an insult. It was a classic move of realpolitik, cornering oneself and one's allies where the only exit lies through the enemy's corpse. This act was also a signal to all of Greece. Sparta showed that the laws of the civilized world no longer applied. An era of absolute cruelty is coming. If we are ready to violate the sacred law of Zeus for freedom, imagine what we will do to you on the battlefield. It was psychological terror, aimed not only at the Persians, but also at wavering Greeks. While Persian heralds in other cities were accepting honors, in Sparta, moans of the dying drifted up from the well. But the city lived its usual life. Training continued, helots worked in the fields. Leonidas, having committed sacrilege, calmly returned to his duties. He knew the gods would forgive the winners. And if not, well, Spartans were used to bargaining with gods in the language of sacrificial blood. In the East, this news had the effect of an exploding bomb. For Xerxes, it was a personal insult. His divine will wasn't just rejected, it was humiliated by a bunch of savages from the Peloponnese. The war machine shifted gears. Now it wasn't about conquest, it was about extermination. The empire moved to wipe Sparta off the face of the earth, to turn its name into a forgotten word. Leonidas looked east and understood. The time for diplomacy was over. The time for physics had begun. A time when the mass of Persian infantry would have to be stopped by the density of the Spartan formation. He made his choice. He chose the war that would become his grave and his pedestal. But while he prepared for battle with the external enemy, his own country prepared a treacherous stab in the back for him. Not with a dagger, but with bureaucracy. The inertia of peaceful life and religious prejudices proved scarier than Persian cavalry. The irony of history loves cruel jokes. At the very moment Xerxes was ferrying his legions across the Hellespont, when bridges made of ships groaned under the weight of millions of boots and chariots kicked up dust to the heavens, Greece's most terrifying military machine suddenly slammed on the brakes. Sparta, that perpetual motion machine of war, stopped. Not out of fear, not due to a lack of weapons. It was paralyzed by what we would today call a bureaucratic nightmare mixed with religious fanaticism. It was August of the year 480, the peak of heat. And by a fatal coincidence, these very days fell on the sacred festival of Carneia. 9 days in honor of Apollo Carneos. 9 days when Spartans, under penalty of death and the curse of the gods, were forbidden from conducting military operations. The law was absolute, no exceptions. Even if the enemy is at the gates, knocking with a battering ram, a Spartan is obliged to sing hymns, not sharpen a sword. Imagine Leonidas's fury. He, the king commander, sees the ring tightening on the map. He receives reports from scouts that the Persian avalanche is already covering northern Greece. Thessaly has fallen. Boeotia is wavering. And they tell him, "Wait, king, the moon isn't full yet. We cannot march until the festival is over." It was a conflict of two realities. The reality of war demanded immediate mobilization. The reality of religion demanded humility. The ephors, 5 old men elected for a year, possessing the power to judge even kings, stood like a wall. For them, the ritual was more important than survival. In their logic, violating the Carneia guaranteed Apollo's wrath, which is more terrifying than any Persian army. "If we anger the gods, we lose anyway," they kept saying, looking at the sky with the unseeing eyes of fanatics. Leonidas looked at them and understood. While they search for omens in the phases of the moon, Xerxes will burn Athens and come for Sparta. The situation seemed like a stalemate. The king couldn't break the law. The ephors would simply arrest him, or worse, declare him a tyrant who put himself above the law. In Sparta, That was a death sentence. But sitting idly by meant betraying Greece. It was here, in the stuffy council hall, not in the gorge of Thermopylae, that Leonidas won his first, most important tactical victory. If you can't break the wall, you have to find a crack in it. He remembered an old law, a gray zone in Lycurgus's constitution. The king has no right to lead out the army during the Carneia. True, but the king has the right to a personal guard when he goes on a journey. No one can forbid the king from taking a walk to the north of the country, right? And no one can forbid him from taking bodyguards with him. This isn't an army, it's an escort. Legally, no war. Actually, a vanguard of suicide troops. It was a genius piece of casuistry. Leonidas beat the bureaucrats on their own field. He told the ephors, "I am not declaring mobilization. I'm just going to check the northern borders. Only 300 men will go with me." The ephors, of course, understood this was a lie. They knew these 300 weren't going for a walk, but into a meat grinder. But formalities were observed. The letter of the law triumphed over the spirit, which meant the elders' consciences were clear. Apollo won't be offended if the king just goes for a walk with his entourage, even if that walk ends in Hades. But Leonidas wouldn't be a product of the Agoge if he didn't turn this forced compromise into a strategic advantage. He understood. 300 men won't stop a million. Physically, it's impossible. But 300 Spartans can buy time. They can become that speed bump on which the Persian chariot breaks an axle. He just needed to hold the narrow pass until the Carneia ended, until the Olympics passed, which, ironically, also prevented other Greeks from fighting, and until the main forces of Hellas could finally gather their shields. Leonidas began the selection, and this selection became another act of cynical humanism. He refused to take young, unmarried guys, those hotheads eager to fight first. Usually, youth is the cannon fodder of war, but the king introduced a strange criterion at first glance. He takes only mature husbands.
Those who already have sons.
Why? Concern for demographics? Yes, Spartan law required that the lineage not be interrupted. If a warrior dies without leaving an heir, the surname disappears. A unit of society vanishes. Leonidas knew that no one would return from this campaign. Therefore, he took only those who had already fulfilled their biological duty to the state. He took those whose death would not put an end to their lineage. It was the mathematics of death. We sacrifice the past, fathers, to save the future, sons. Imagine this scene. The king walks along the line of the world's best warriors and weeds them out. You don't have a son? Step out of line. You stay. Pleas, curses, tears of rage, all useless. Leonidas was adamant. He was assembling not just a unit, but a suicide club whose members had living copies at home. This reduced the burden of responsibility. In Sparta, death was a profession, but the destruction of a lineage was considered a tragedy. A surreal atmosphere reigned in the city. On the streets, they were preparing for the holiday. Musicians tuned flutes, priests washed sacrificial animals, youth rehearsed dances. And amidst this carnival, 300 men in full combat gear silently sharpened swords. One city, two worlds. The world of celebration trying to close its eyes to reality, and the world of war looking straight into that reality's pupils. Leonidas got his way. He received permission for death. The ephors sighed with relief. The restless king is leaving. The problem resolves itself. Traditions are observed. They thought they were sending him to the slaughter to appease fate. They didn't understand that he was going not to die, but to create a new myth that would outlive them, their laws, and Sparta itself. The bureaucratic machine creaked and issued an exit permit. The personal guard was formed. The plan was insane, 300 against infinity. But in this madness lay cold logic. If Sparta cannot come to war with all its might, it will come with its quality. Leonidas didn't take quantity. He took concentrated rage. That evening, before leaving, the king might have looked at the full moon, because of which his army stayed home, and smirked. The moon shone equally for everyone, Persians and Greeks. But only he knew that the next few days would paint this silver light red. The bureaucrats stayed to shuffle papyruses and interpret bird flights. The warriors tightened straps on their armor. The time for words was over. The time for the march, which would become a funeral procession lasting an eternity, was beginning. The dawn over Lacedaemon that morning was gray, as if the sky itself had thrown on a mourning himation. There were no trumpets, no solemn speeches. 300 men lined up at the northern gates in absolute silence. It didn't look like a military campaign Greece was used to. Usually an army is noise. Horses neighing, carts creaking, drunken laughter and swearing. Here stood silence, broken only by the breathing of 300 chests and the rare clang of bronze on bronze. This wasn't an army. It was a funeral procession, where the dead walked to their graves on their own 2 legs, carrying their tombstones, their heavy hoplon shields, on their shoulders. Each of these men was personally selected by Leonidas based on one cruel but pragmatic criterion: having a son. There were no childless men in the ranks. Behind each of these 300, a boy remained in Sparta, blood of their blood, who would continue the line. This untied their hands. This turned off the fear for the family's future. They knew, even if their bodies rotted in the gorge, their genes were already copied and living. It was a march of doomed fathers who bought their children's lives with their own death before even taking the first step. The farewell was short, like a knife strike. No tears, no hugs that could soften a warrior's heart. Spartan women didn't cry in public. It was a disgrace equal to a husband's cowardice. Queen Gorgo, standing before her husband's chariot, didn't ask him to return. She knew where he was going. She knew the arithmetic of war. 300 against 1,000,000. There was no hope, and it would have been foolish to feign it. "What should I do when you don't return?" she asked, looking him straight in the eyes. "Find a good husband and bear good children," Leonidas answered. This wasn't cynicism. It was the highest form of care. He was releasing her from a vow of fidelity to a dead man. Life must go on. The state needs new soldiers. And then came the phrase that would become the epitaph of this entire era. Women handing shields to their husbands said not, "I love you," and not, "Take care." They said, "With it or on it." Come back with victory, carrying the shield, or come back dead when comrades carry you on the shield. There is no third option. Throwing away the shield to run faster meant losing citizenship, honor, and the right to be called a human. A coward in Sparta was worse than a corpse. No one spoke to him. No one gave him fire. His daughters were not given husbands. 300 fathers took their shields. They knew that for them, the "with it" option was unavailable. They were going to lie on them. The column moved north. The rhythm of steps, left, right, kicked dust from the road that remembered Hercules' footprints. They walked fast, devouring miles with the endurance of a wolf pack. On the way, allies joined them. Arcadians, Corinthians, Thespians, Thebans. about 7,000 men in total. They looked at the Spartans with reverent horror and hope. These people, potters, peasants, blacksmiths who took up spears, believed Leonidas was leading them to victory. They believed Sparta's genius would work a miracle. They didn't know what the king knew. In Leonidas's head, like the obsessive rhythm of a drum, rang the prophecy of the Delphic oracle received the day before. The Pythia, having inhaled poisonous fumes from the crevice, wheezed a terrible choice. Look, inhabitants of vast Sparta, either your great glorious city will be destroyed by the descendants of Perseus, or the border of Lacedaemon will mourn the death of a king from the line of Hercules. It was a deal, a divine barter. The king's life in exchange for the city's life. Leonidas wasn't a superstitious fanatic, but he knew how to count. If his death was the price for saving Sparta, he would pay it without bargaining. He didn't tell the allies about the prophecy. Why deprive them of morale? Let them hope. Hope makes the hand grip the spear tighter, and knowledge of the inevitable end is a commander's privilege. As they moved north, the landscape changed. Olive groves were replaced by rocks. The air became heavier. They were approaching a place nature itself created for murder. Thermopylae, the hot gates, a narrow strip of land between the sheer wall of Mount Calidromus and the swamps of the Malian Gulf. Hot sulfur springs bubbled here, filling the air with the smell of rotten eggs, the smell of the underworld, the entrance to Hades, as the soldiers joked. Geography here worked like a trap. At the narrowest point, the passage constricted so much that two wagons could barely pass each other. 50 feet of width. 50 feet that turned Xerxes' million-strong army into a useless crowd. Here, numbers didn't matter. Here, only the density of the formation and the length of the spear mattered. Leonidas examined the position with an engineer's eye. He saw an old, dilapidated wall, built once by the Phocians for protection against the Thessalians. "Rebuild it," he ordered. This would be their barricade, their tombstone. When the Greeks took their position, they saw something that would make anyone shudder, except Agoge graduates. The northern horizon ceased to exist. The entire plain before Thermopylae, as far as the eye could see, was covered with people, horses, tents. At night, it seemed as if all the stars in the sky had fallen to earth. So many fires the Persians burned. This wasn't an army. It was a migration of nations. Scouts reported that the Persians drank dry the rivers they crossed, that their arrows would blot out the sun. The allies panicked. At the war council, whispers of retreat began to crawl. "There are too few of us," they said. "This is suicide." Leonidas cut off the panic with a single look. He didn't make inspiring speeches about freedom. He simply said they would stay here. In Sparta, panic is treated with discipline. But to calm the others, he sent messengers to the cities demanding reinforcements, knowing perfectly well they wouldn't arrive in time. It was a white lie to save morale. Amidst this sea of fear, the Spartans behaved with provocative calmness, bordering on madness. A Persian scout, a rider who risked getting close to the wall, saw a strange scene. The Spartans weren't building fortifications, weren't praying, weren't sharpening swords. They were combing their long hair and doing gymnastics. Xerxes, hearing the scouts' report, laughed. He thought these savages were preening before surrendering. He was explained, "King, you didn't understand. Sparta has a custom. In the face of mortal danger, warriors adorn their heads. They aren't cleaning themselves up for you. They are preparing for death like for a holiday. They want to look beautiful when they meet the gods." For Xerxes, this was unfathomable. He waited 4 days. 4 long days of silence, giving the Greeks time to realize the hopelessness of the situation and run. He didn't want a battle. He wanted submission. Madmen, he thought. Fate itself is against me. I bring 80 nations with me. What can 300 men do against an avalanche? On the 5th day, the King of Kings' patience snapped. He sent a parlementaire to the wall with a final offer. The rider stopped at a safe distance and shouted so everyone could hear. The King of Kings, Xerxes, offers you life. Lay down your weapons, and you will become friends of the Persian people. You will receive lands better than yours. Surrender your weapons. Leonidas's answer sounded not like a shout, but like a whip crack in the silence. 2 words. 2 words that became the motto of all hopeless wars of the future. He didn't enter into a discussion. He didn't bargain. He shouted, "Come and take them!" This was the end of diplomacy, the end of waiting. Xerxes, sitting on a golden throne set on a hill to better view his army's triumph, waved his hand. The avalanche began to move. First went the Medes and Scythians, light infantry, the empire's cannon fodder. They ran howling, sure they would simply sweep away this handful of insolent men. Leonidas put on his helmet. The world narrowed to a T-shaped slit in the bronze. The smell of sulfur mixed with the smell of sweat. He felt the shoulder of the neighbor on the right, and knew the neighbor on the left felt his shoulder. The phalanx locked shields. A click, and the wall became a monolith. A living tank, bristling with spear needles, froze waiting for the impact. The earth trembled from the running of thousands of legs. The air darkened from the first cloud of arrows. But in the hot gates it was cold. The icy calm of professionals who had waited all their lives for this exact second. "Hold the line!" raced through the ranks. First impact. Bronze met flesh. The meat grinder turned on. The first minutes of the battle destroyed all Persian notions of war. Xerxes, watching from his high throne, expected to see his human wave simply wash away the Greeks, like the tide washes away a sandcastle. But physics that day worked against the empire. In the narrow throat of Thermopylae, numbers ceased to be an advantage and became a deadly trap. Imagine a hydraulic press. Persian commanders drove their soldiers forward with whip strikes, creating monstrous pressure from the rear. But at the front, they ran into a monolithic wall of Spartan bronze. The rear rows pushed the front ones, literally impaling their own comrades on Greek spears. This wasn't a battle in the usual sense, where there is room for fencing or personal skill. It was a slaughterhouse. Industrial-scale processing of living force into dead matter. The Medes and Scythians, the first Xerxes threw into the expenditure, were doomed before they took the first swing. Look at their equipment. Wicker shields, short spears, fabric tunics. They were magnificent in maneuver warfare on the open plains of Asia. But here, in the cramped space where you can't flank, they turned out to be naked men against tanks. The Spartan hoplon shield covered a man from chin to knees. The shield wall was solid, without gaps. From this bronze scale, like the stingers of a giant insect, spears flew out rhythmically. 1, a jab to the face. 2, a jab to the throat. 3, a step forward over the bodies. The sound of this battle was terrible. It wasn't the clashing of swords that movies love so much. It was the dull, wet crunch of breaking bones and the crack of wood as heavy shields smashed into faces. Spartans worked silently. No battle cries, no berserker rage, Only short commands from officers, audible through the roar of the dying crowd. Economy of movement was absolute. Why swing, opening your side, if a short spear thrust from the hip is enough? Xerxes jumped up from his throne 3 times in horror and bewilderment. His army, having conquered half the world, was shattering against 300 men like waves against a rock. He saw his soldiers grabbing Spartan spears with bare hands, trying to break the shafts, and dying, pierced by swords. By lunch, the ground before the Phocian wall turned into a bloody swamp. Hoplites literally had to climb over mountains of corpses to get to live enemies. Realizing the cannon fodder wasn't coping, the King of Kings played his main card. He recalled the battered units and sent in the elite. 10,000 immortals under the command of Hydarnes. They went into battle in complete silence, glittering with gold jewelry and expensive armor. They were called immortals not because they didn't die, but because as soon as one fell, his place in the formation was instantly taken by another, keeping the number unchanged.
This was the Guard, the Emperor's personal security, the best killers of the East.
The Spartans met them with a tactical move that would enter military textbooks as the standard of discipline: a feigned retreat. Imagine the level of coordination. In the heat of battle, at a single flute signal, the entire phalanx suddenly turns its back to the enemy and runs away. The Persians, seeing Greek backs, bought it instantly. The formation broke. With a wild howl, the immortals rushed in pursuit, anticipating an easy massacre of running cowards. They lost their formation, turning into a crowd of hunters. And then the trap snapped shut. At a sharp signal, like a whip crack, the Spartans, like a single organism, turned 180 degrees. Instantly. The shield wall closed right in front of the stunned Persians' noses. The scattered crowd of immortals, having lost their ranks, crashed into bronze. The effect was crushing. Spartans mowed down the empire's elite like a peasant mows ripe wheat. In the cramped space, the Greeks' long spears had the advantage over the Persians' short akinakes. Gold armor didn't save from strikes aimed at the neck and groin. The immortals died just as easily as the peasants before them. Their vaunted training proved useless against the geometry of the phalanx. They couldn't penetrate the shields. They couldn't reach the enemy. It was psychological shock. The elite realized they were helpless. Leonidas, fighting in the front row, was not just a king. He was the metronome of this slaughter, setting the rhythm of the killing. This nightmare for the Persians continued for 2 days. For 2 days, Xerxes changed tactics, sending first one group, then another, trying to crush with mass, bury with arrows, intimidate. But the hot gates were securely locked. Spartans relieved each other. While some held the wall, others rested right behind their backs, sitting on stones, chewing bread, and washing it down with water mixed with wine. They were tired, their muscles burned with fire, hands cramped from the weight of shields, but morally they were fresh. They saw that a god could be made to bleed. By the end of the second day, it became clear. The frontal assault had failed. Xerxes was furious and in despair. The greatest army in the world was stuck in front of a bunch of Greek marginals. He had already begun thinking about a shameful retreat, or a long wait until hunger smoked the Spartans out of their hole. The bronze wall seemed indestructible. Neither strength, nor cunning, nor the magic of priests could break it. But in the history of wars, it often happens that the fate of empires is decided not by generals, but by traitors. Not by the strength of metal, but by the rot of the human soul. While Leonidas wiped blood from his sword, and Spartans joked over the corpses of immortals, a local resident was brought to Xerxes' camp. His name was Ephialtes, a name that in the Greek language would become synonymous with
nightmare. He wasn't a warrior. He was a nobody. But he had goods worth more than all the treasures of Susa. Ephialtes knew the path, an old, forgotten goat path that led through the mountains bypassing Thermopylae. He looked at the gold in the hands of the Persian treasurer and didn't see betrayal of his people. He saw only a chance to escape poverty. That night, he sold Greece for a sack of coins. Leonidas's impregnable position, which millions couldn't take, collapsed because of one greedy glance and a couple of words whispered in the king's tent. The secret ceased to be a secret. The encirclement mechanism was launched. The shadow of betrayal fell on the Spartans' shoulders, longer and darker than the shadow of Mount Calidromus at sunset. Sometimes the greatest empires collapse not from a battering ram's blow, but from a whisper. That night, while the Spartans slept, confident in the impregnability of their stone wall, the fate of Greece was being decided on a narrow path overgrown with oaks, high above their heads. The Anopeia path. Locals knew about it but kept quiet. Leonidas knew about it and placed a guard. Xerxes didn't know about it until a traitor pointed a finger at the dark mountain slope. You need to understand one thing about Ephialtes' betrayal. It wasn't an instant act of villainy. It was a long, grueling climb up the mountain. Imagine 10,000 immortals under Hydarnes' command, sneaking in complete darkness. The night was quiet, windless. Under the feet of thousands of soldiers, last year's foliage crunched, dry as parchment. This sound, like the rustle of a giant snake, should have been a signal of alarm. And it became one. At the top of the ridge stood 1,000 Phocians. Leonidas had entrusted them with guarding this path, entrusting them, essentially, with the key to Thermopylae's back door. It was a mistake. The Phocians were brave men, but they weren't Spartans. They were militiamen defending their homes. When, in the pre-dawn mist, they heard the crunch of leaves and saw the glint of Persian armor, panic seized them. Hydarnes, expecting to meet Spartans, was no less frightened, but learning from the traitor that facing him were only Phocians, ordered them buried in arrows. And here a catastrophe occurred. The Phocians, instead of blocking the path and fighting to the last, committed tactical stupidity. They retreated to the top of the hill, preparing for a circular defense. They thought the Persians had come for them. What naivety. Hydarnes didn't even pursue them. He simply walked past. He wasn't going to kill Phocians. He was going to snap the trap shut behind Leonidas's back. The path to the Greek army's rear was open. News travels faster than armies. Even before sunrise, deserters from the Persian camp ran into the Spartan camp, and then breathless scouts descended from the mountains. Their report was shorter than a Cephas strike. They are behind us. At that moment, Thermopylae ceased to be a fortress and turned into a grave. The strategic situation changed instantly. On one side, Xerxes' million-strong armada, ready for a frontal assault. On the other, the empire's elite descending from the mountains to strike the unprotected back. The war council convened at dawn looked like hope's funeral. The allies were terrified. Commanders of Peloponnesian cities, ready to stand to the death just yesterday, now saw before them only the specter of agonizing death in encirclement. They talked about needing to retreat, save the army, give battle elsewhere. Fear, sticky, cold fear, filled the tent. And then, Leonidas made a decision that finally moved him from the rank of commanders to the rank of legends. It wasn't a gesture of despair. It was a cold, mathematical calculation. Leonidas understood. If everyone runs now, the Persian cavalry will catch them on the plain and slaughter them from behind. It won't be a retreat, but a massacre.
Someone has to stay. Someone has to keep the door open while the rest save themselves. Someone has to die so the army can live. "Go," he told the allies. "Spartan law forbids us to retreat, but you are free. Save your lives for future battles." He literally kicked out most of the army. It was an act of supreme pragmatism. Why bury 7,000 men where 300 are enough to create a myth? He didn't let them go out of pity, but out of strategic thrift. Greece would need these soldiers at Plataea. But not only Spartans stayed, and this fact is often forgotten, blinded by the shine of red cloaks. Alongside Leonidas, 700 Thespians under the command of Demophilus stayed voluntarily. Think about that. Spartans were prepared for death from birth. Their law obliged them to die. The Thespians had no such law. They were free citizens, militiamen who could leave with a clear conscience. But they stayed. 700 men chose certain death in a foreign gorge simply because they couldn't allow Spartans to die alone. This is true, quiet heroism, devoid of the pathos of drill. There were also 400 Thebans, but the story with them is more complicated. Herodotus, who hated Thebes, writes that Leonidas kept them forcibly as hostages because he suspected their city of colluding with the Persians. Imagine their position, standing in a suicide formation under the gun not only of the enemy, but also of their own allies. So the army melted before eyes. Thousands of warriors packed up camps and left south, hiding their eyes in shame. They left to live. A handful of madmen remained in the gorge. 300 Spartans, 700 Thespians, 400 Thebans. A little over 1,000 men against the full might of Asia. The air that morning was transparent and ringing. Leonidas watched the allies leave and, perhaps, felt relief. Now everything became simple. No politics, no arguments, no hopes for a miracle. Only pure, distilled war. Leonidas knew the prophecy. Either the city falls or the king dies. Now he saw the prophecy coming true. He was the lamb Sparta laid on the altar of victory. But this lamb had fangs and was clad in bronze. He was going to sell his life at the highest exchange rate in history. When the sun rose higher, illuminating the empty camp and the thinned ranks, the king performed a rite that would shock any other general. He ordered his men to have breakfast. Calmly, without rushing. "Eat, friends," he said, and in his voice sounded the grim irony of a man who already sees the other bank of the Styx. "Eat your fill, for tonight we dine in Hades." This wasn't a joke. It was the schedule for the day.
They knew their schedule to the minute. Breakfast, battle, death, eternity. Ephialtes' betrayal didn't break them. On the contrary, it liberated them. The need to save strength, hold the line to protect the passage, and think about tomorrow disappeared. There was no tomorrow. There was only this endless day, which had to be filled with such horror for the enemy that Persians would shudder at the word Spartan for another 100 years. Leonidas changed tactics. If before they stood in a narrow place using the wall's protection, now it made no sense. They were being surrounded. He decided to lead the men out onto the open space, to go out to meet the avalanche, to turn the fight into a meat grinder where you can kill the maximum number of enemies before you are crushed. It was no longer a tactical battle. It was an act of suicidal terror. They checked shield fastenings, tightened greave straps, looked at each other for the last time,
memorizing faces covered in dust and sweat.
Thespians stood shoulder to shoulder with Spartans. Thebans trembled but held the line. In the distance, Persian trumpets sounded. From the rear approached the immortals. From the front loomed the main armada. The trap snapped shut. The beast was cornered. But the Persians forgot that a cornered beast is the most dangerous. Leonidas raised his sword. The tragedy's final act was beginning. The sun stood at its zenith when the phrase sounded that history would turn into a beautiful aphorism, but which, at that moment, was a dry statement of fact. Today, we dine in Hades. Leonidas wasn't joking. In the Spartan daily schedule, where every action from wake up to lights out was regulated, death became just another item on the agenda. Breakfast, check. Formation, check. Death, according to plan. Dinner, already in the afterlife. This absolute acceptance of the inevitable liberated them. The last break disappeared. The instinct of self-preservation. If in the previous 2 days the Greeks fought like professionals, using tactics, formation geometry, and the narrow pass defense, now they discarded the war textbooks. Leonidas gave an order that seemed like suicide, even for a Spartan. Move out of Thermopylae's narrow bottleneck. Move onto the open space, to where they could be surrounded instantly. Why? The answer is simple and terrible. To increase the contact area with the enemy. The narrow passage limited not only the Persians, it limited the Spartans too. In the narrows, only the front rows could kill. On the wide field, everyone could kill, and die at once. It was no longer defense, it was a harvest. Spartans turned into a living meat grinder, striving to grind as much enemy flesh as possible before the gears broke. Can you imagine this moment? 300 Spartans, 700 Thespians, and 400 Thebans don't wait for the blow, but throw themselves at the million-strong army. It was an explosion of rage accumulated over 3 days. No, over a lifetime. They crashed into Persian ranks with such force that the enemy's front lines simply burst. Persian officers with whips drove their soldiers forward onto Greek spears because they feared Spartans more than the king's wrath. People fell into the sea, drowned, were trampled by their own comrades. The ground became slippery and red, and warriors had to balance on bodies like on bumps in a swamp. It was in this phase of battle that technological degradation occurred. Long dory spears, the phalanx's main weapon, broke almost immediately. Wood doesn't withstand blows against hundreds of shields and bones. Xiphos swords came into play, short Spartan swords, looking more like large knives. Have you ever tried fighting with a knife against a spear? It requires closing to breathing distance. Spartans burst into the dense mass of enemies, working swords like sewing needles. Strike to the neck, strike under the rib, strike to the face, and then the swords broke too. Bronze bent, iron dulled. And that's when what plunged the Persians into mystical horror began. Left without weapons, the Spartans didn't surrender. They started tearing at the enemy with their hands and teeth. Imagine an immortal legionnaire, clad in armor, at whom a bloodied, dust-covered man throws himself, knocks away the shield with a fist strike, and sinks his teeth into the throat. These were no longer humans. These were demons of war escaped from Tartarus. They fought with shield fragments, rocks picked up from the ground, their own helmets. In the center of this bloody maelstrom stood Leonidas. He didn't hide behind bodyguards' backs. He was the tip of the wedge. And, just as the oracle predicted, the king fell.
He didn't die beautifully, delivering a farewell speech. In the chaos of hand-to-hand combat, he was simply covered by a wave of enemies. But his death became the signal for perhaps the most furious episode of the entire battle: the fight for the body. For an ancient person, the king's body is a sacred object. Giving it to the enemy for desecration meant covering oneself in eternal shame. A fight flared up around Leonidas's corpse so intense that, according to Herodotus, the Greeks pushed the Persians back 4 times. 4 times! A handful of wounded, exhausted men threw back fresh enemy units just to drag out their commander's dead body. They dragged him by the legs, covered him with their shields, fell on top, creating a mound of their own bodies. 2 of Xerxes' brothers, Abracomes and Hyperanthes, died in this pile-up trying to get to the Spartan king. But physics is relentless. From the rear approached those very units of Hydarnes, led by the traitor Ephialtes. The ring closed. The surviving Greeks, taking Leonidas's body, retreated to a small hill at the exit of the gorge. Kolonos Hill. This was their last citadel. The Thebans, those hostages of the situation, broke at this moment. They dropped their weapons and ran to the Persians, shouting they were here under duress. Xerxes spared their lives, but ordered the royal brand burned onto their foreheads. They survived, but became slaves. Spartans and Thespians remained on the hill. The scene on Kolonos Hill is the apotheosis of tragedy and greatness. Imagine, a few dozen men. Most have no shields. Many have no weapons. They stand in a tight circle, in the center of which lies their king's body. Around them is a sea of enemies. The Persians could have just climbed up and slaughtered them in hand-to-hand combat. There were thousands against dozens. But they were afraid. Fear of the Spartan monsters was so great that no one wanted to approach them within arm's strike distance. Persian officers couldn't force their soldiers to climb that hill. Even an unarmed Spartan seemed more dangerous to them than a tiger. Then Xerxes, seeing this paralysis of his army, gave an order that was an admission of his powerlessness in a fair fight. "Arrows!" The sky darkened. Thousands of archers pulled bowstrings. It wasn't aimed fire. It was hail. A downpour of iron and wood. Spartans didn't try to take cover. There was nothing to take cover with. They just stood and accepted death. Arrows pierced armor, entered flesh, pinned them to the ground. One by one they fell, silently, without screams. The last one to fall was perhaps some nameless Thespian or Spartan whose name we will never know. He simply sank to his knees, looking like a hedgehog from arrows sticking out of his body, and buried his face in the dusty earth of Hellas. Silence reigned on the hill. A silence so dense and heavy that ears rang. Dust slowly settled, revealing a terrible picture. A hill covered with a carpet of bodies, from which a forest of Persian arrows stuck out. The battle was over. Xerxes, king of kings, climbed this hill.
He walked on the corpses of his enemies but felt no joy of victory.
He lost 20,000 men. He lost 2 brothers. He lost 3 days. And all this just to kill 300 men who, even dead, looked like they were ready to jump up and tear out his throat. He searched for Leonidas. When the body was found, chopped up, stabbed, almost unrecognizable under a layer of blood and dust, Xerxes committed an act that shocked even his inner circle. Persians usually respected valiant enemies, but here, rage and fear overpowered nobility. The king ordered Leonidas's head cut off and impaled on a stake. This wasn't punishment. It was hysteria. Xerxes tried to kill a legend, humiliate a symbol, prove to himself that this man was mortal. But looking at the empty eyes of the severed head, Xerxes perhaps realized he had lost. He could chop off the head, could burn the body, could grind Sparta into powder. But he couldn't erase from his soldiers' memory the horror they experienced in the hot gates. He won the battle for the pass, but lost the war for souls. The myth was born. And this myth was more dangerous than any army. Leonidas's blood, soaked into the earth of Thermopylae, became the seed from which the iron harvest of Plataea would sprout a year later. The Spartan cult of death fulfilled its task. It bought immortality at the cost of everything. The silence that descended on Kolonos Hill was deceptive. It wasn't the silence of peace, but the calm before the real storm destined to sweep away the ambitions of the East. When the smoke cleared and the screams of the dying faded, Xerxes personally walked across the battlefield. He walked not as a victor, but as a man trying to convince himself the nightmare was over. He needed to see the corpse. He needed physical proof that the Spartan king was just meat and bones, not an immortal demon. When Leonidas's body was extracted from under the mountain of corpses, disfigured, stabbed, stripped of that majestic armor that shone 3 days ago, the King of Kings made a mistake. A fatal, strategic mistake. He gave in to emotions. Usually, Persians honored the valor of enemies. Brave commanders were buried with honors, paying tribute to their spirit. But the fear Leonidas instilled in Xerxes' heart was irrational. The king ordered the Spartan's head cut off and impaled on a stake. For the Greek world, this wasn't just an insult, it was a shock. Barbarism violating all laws of gods and men. But Xerxes didn't understand one thing. By trying to humiliate Leonidas, he elevated him to the rank of a martyr. The head on a stake didn't scare the Hellenes, it enraged them. If up to this moment many city-states thought about negotiations, about earth and water, seeing the desecrated body of the hero king made compromise impossible. Now it was a war of extermination. Xerxes wanted to show strength, but showed his fear of a dead man. The sacrifice at Thermopylae worked exactly as Leonidas's cold, Spartan mind calculated. It was the perfect investment. 300 lives were exchanged for the enemy's moral breakdown and the unification of allies. In Athens, learning of the Spartans' death, Themistocles realized the time for half measures was over. The Greek fleet, inspired by the example of self-sacrifice, gave battle at Salamis and smashed the Persian armada. The wooden walls of ships became the continuation of Thermopylae's bronze shields. But the real finale of this bloody drama played out a year later, in the year 479. Sparta, that slow, heavy-to-lift Leviathan, finally woke up for real. The death of one of the kings demanded blood. Not diplomacy, not reparations, but total extermination of the guilty. Leonidas's nephew, Pausanias, became regent for Leonidas's young son, and he led out into the field not 300 men. On the plain near the city of Plataea lined up the most powerful army Hellas had ever seen. Tens of thousands of hoplites, and in the center, like a steel core, stood 5,000 Spartans. 5,000 professional killers who had passed the Agoge. They didn't come to die. They came to avenge. The Battle of Plataea became a mirror image of Thermopylae. If in the gorge the Persians pressed with mass, here on the plain, the Spartan phalanx showed what a steamroller was. They walked silently to the rhythmic sound of flutes, not breaking formation even under a hail of arrows. The Persian infantry, lacking heavy weaponry, retreated in horror. Spartans weren't just winning, they were staging a massacre. They avenged every drop of Leonidas's blood, every arrow fired into his body. General Mardonius, left by Xerxes to complete the conquest, was killed. His army ceased to exist. It was there, on the field of Plataea, that it became finally clear. Leonidas won. His death at Thermopylae wasn't the end, but the beginning of the end for the Persian Empire. He launched a mechanism that was impossible to stop. Xerxes, fleeing back to Asia, took with him not trophies, but a nightmare about people who laugh in the face of death. He realized too late, you cannot defeat a people who love their freedom more than life and hate slavery more than pain. And what about Leonidas? His body was eventually returned to Sparta. He was reburied with honors worthy of a demigod. But his true monument is not a tomb. It is the epitaph carved on stone at Thermopylae by the poet Simonides. Simple, dry words containing not an ounce of pathos, only a statement of fact regarding the fulfillment of an order. Stranger, bear word to the Spartans we met here, that, obeying their laws, here we lie. Think about these lines. They don't speak of saving Greece, of freedom or glory. They speak of laws, of the command, of discipline. Leonidas and his men died not because they wanted to become heroes. They died because they received an order to stand and not retreat, and they executed it with bureaucratic precision. This is the terrifying beauty of the Spartan myth. This is not a story about a soulful impulse. It is a story about how a system created for war worked at 100% efficiency. Leonidas was a product, the perfect item from the Agoge factory. He was taught to suppress the human in himself for the sake of the warrior function. And he succeeded. He gave up fatherhood, old age, royal comfort, life itself, to become a living shield for a civilization that, ironically, despised Spartan cruelty, but survived only thanks to it. Athens gave the world philosophy, theater, and democracy. Sparta gave the world Leonidas, so Athens could do all that. We look at this story through the prism of centuries and see a legend. We see Gerard Butler with abs drawn on a computer. We see a comic book. But reality was dirtier, scarier, and more majestic. It was a story about how the dehumanization of a person can lead to a superhuman result. Spartans gave up everything that makes us human: compassion, fear, individuality, and received immortality in return. And now, standing on the ruins of this history, I want to ask you one question. A question that won't give you peace. Look at Leonidas not as a hero, but as a man whose childhood was stolen, whose psyche was broken, and who was sent to slaughter for state interests. Is a legend that songs will be composed about for 3,000 years worth turning a living human into a tool? Are you ready to pay such a price for eternity? To give up humanity to become a bronze idol? Or maybe the real feat is not to die beautifully, but to live life while preserving the ability to feel another's pain. Each must find the answer to this question themselves. But remember, while we argue, in the shadows of the Thermopylae Gorge, the ghost of the king still stands, smiling, knowing he won his main game, the game with death.